morning, everyone. Welcome to WAN-IFRA's Digital Security for Journalists during COVID-19 webinar. We're very, very pleased to have with us and joining us in the next few minutes, participants from 14 countries, from 50, 60 different publications across the region. So we're very, very excited to have so many of you from all over Asia and even the United States. We have some registrants coming in from the United States as well, joining us today. Javier Garza, our speaker, is a long-time supporter and very active member of WAN-IFRA. He is the safety advisor to the World Editors Forum, which is the editors community within WAN-IFRA. I am Junie Lau, coming to you from Singapore. I am heading the APAC regional office here at WAN-IFRA. And with me today is my whole team, Wilson, Jen, Serene, Jeanette, and Tom, who are also assisting on this webinar. So welcome everybody. Please feel free to introduce yourselves because we have so many participants from all over the region. Say hello because I'm sure you will find friends, colleagues from across Asia that who are on this webinar. We have folks from Bhutan, Cambodia, Fiji, Hong Kong, India, Indonesia. Huge group from Indonesia registered today. Japan, Malaysia, Myanmar, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam, and the United States. So please feel free to introduce yourselves and say hi to your colleagues from across the region. Today, we hope as well that you will not just take away very valuable learnings from Javier, who is in Mexico. He is in Torreón, okay, and he will tell us more later about there he is and what he does in Mexico. He is a long-time journalist and also editorial director previously of El Siglo de Torreón, where he developed safety protocols for covering a wave of violence unleashed by organized crime groups in the city. His own publication then had also been the target of kidnappings and violence.
Sorry, those are my daughters. I just think to say hello.
Hi, everybody. Yes, very fun and spontaneous. It is night time in Mexico, so thank you very much, Javier, for doing this. He is now he now runs the local news platform Andrea Dos Laguna, and he will tell us more about what he does. But in the meantime, just very quickly, in the meantime, just a few little housekeeping arrangements here. Javier will speak for about 30-40 minutes, and then after that, we will actually throw it open to you guys, share your experiences. Please, there are so many folks here from different countries. I know some of you have covered literally riots, protests, wars in your own country. So please feel free to share as well, not just your physical, stories of physical threats or violence, but digital threats and violence as well, because increasingly that has become a huge issue that we need to understand, and how do we deal with these digital attacks. They are still threats to journalists. In the Philippines, for example, there have been well documented instances of threats of violence against journalists, and of course physical as well. So later what he's going to do is invite you to share your own personal stories. What we can do this in a couple of ways. One is to just raise your hand. There is there is a raise your hand button at the bottom of your screen. So just raise your hand and tell us that you'd like to speak. It'll give us about 2-3 seconds to activate that. So what I'll do is we'll call on you, because there might be several people wanting to raise their hand. I'll call on you and just give us 2-3 seconds to activate your mic. So you'll receive a message to say to request to unmute. Then you acknowledge that, and you can also, if you have your webcam attached to your camera, you can also to your laptop, you can also turn on your camera. So then you speak to Javier and address everyone, and you will appear on screen. If you don't have a webcam, don't worry about it. Just ask your question or share your. Alternatively, if you'd like to type in your questions, you can too for Javier. If you'd like to share your story, perhaps we could pick it up. I guess you could pick it up also in the Q&A. please put all those questions and your stories in the Q&A so that we can actually monitor that. For everything else, like your own personal introductions and your little chatter amongst yourselves, or even just reactions to what Javier is saying, you could put that in the chat. Okay, so that's the difference between the chat box and the Q&A box. The Q&A box actually helps us focus on the questions and some of the sort of official responses to Javier's questions. So that's about it, really. After, if you're on screen describing your story or asking your question for Javier, then after you've finished, we will switch you back, and then your mic and your camera will be switched off. Okay, so I think without further ado, I think we'll hand it over to Javier to start his presentation.
Okay. Thank you, Jenny, and thanks everyone. It's actually evening, still Monday evening here in Mexico. So the idea is, when to talk about digital security right now, and as Jenny said, I'm sure everyone has has had a significant experience with the need for safety measures when working as a journalist in Asia, just as we have in Mexico and Latin America and elsewhere. I thought it would be redundant to just give another webinar on digital security. So I thought really that the approach that was most suitable for this is, how all of our experience when dealing with safety issues throughout the years and throughout the different challenges that we have suffered, organized crime in Mexico, for example, repressive governments in some countries in Asia, social unrest, disturbances, protests, natural disasters, all of the experiences and all of the circumstances when we as journalists have had to develop safety protocols and safety measures in physical, digital, legal, psychological areas, how that knowledge that we have been able to amass over the years, how that knowledge translates into covering the pandemic. But the pandemic is, in a very significant way for journalists, a safety issue. We don't just go out in the streets and cover this because our health is really at risk. So we need to start thinking, just as we thought before, how do I prepare myself to go cover a natural disaster? How do I prepare myself to go cover a street protest? How do I prepare myself when I'm doing investigative work? What kind of security layers I must add to my work? Then in this case, when I'm covering the pandemic, when I'm working, when I'm visiting hospitals, when I'm interacting with people that might be infected, when I'm doing research on cases, on deaths, on hospitalizations, how can I protect my digital activities? And digital security becomes more and more important, not just because those who want to attack journalists, potential aggressors, are getting more sophisticated in their types of attacks, but it becomes increasingly important because journalists are increasingly conducting our professional lives and our personal lives on electronic devices and on digital, in the digital world. So we need to find a way to protect that. So I'm going to share my screen here and start just a small presentation on basic recommendations that that we need to take and to how to think in a systematic way about security. So here we go. Okay, so first of all, we need to think about, what are the different stages of our journalistic work? There is and because each one of these stages requires a particular level of safety or particular measures for safety. One is reporting, of course, whether we're in the field or we're in our desks, going through databases or visualizations or research, whatever. Our contact with sources, especially right now that we are conducting more and more of our communications with sources remotely. Another stage is how are we interacting in social media? What kind of information are we putting out on social media? What can someone who might be a potential attacker learn from us when they're looking through our social media. The editing process also needs a different layer of protection. The communication between reporters and editors, it needs a layer of protection. The way that editors collaborate and exchange information, again, now that it's being done remotely in many newsrooms. And of course, publishing. What's the impact that a particular story can have, and how that might provoke an attack? Maybe, you know, somebody's going to be interested in hacking our files, for example, after a particular investigation. Each stage, as I was saying, requires specific measures. Types of coverage. I mean, we know the different types of coverage that can that would need a safety plan. But when covering the pandemic, you know, when covering specifically COVID-19 and all its ramifications and all its implications, what are we covering? Are we working in hospitals? Are we working in funerals? That is, are we going to come into contact with people who are infected or with people who are at a large risk of infection? I was doing some reporting on hospitals in my hometown, and you know, first thing that you need to think about is, what am I going to wear? Gloves, face masks. Is there a moment where, or a circumstance where I'm going to need a full protective equipment, for example? I'm going to need to be at a safe distance from the person that I'm interviewing. I'm gonna wash my hands when I go in and wash my hands right after I go out, and be very conscious about not touching my face. All of that has to factor in my considerations or my safety considerations. I was doing an interview recently with a doctor who she leads the groups of people who are driving all around the city taking tests of people who suspect of being infected. And at some point, I hadn't realized it before, but at some point in the middle of the interview, I started realizing that I was speaking to the person, probably the one person in my hometown who was most at risk of contracting COVID-19, just because she interacted every day with 50 or 60 people, many of whom were actually infected. It was at the middle of the interview that I kind of started feeling a little bit uncomfortable, even if you know, I was about a couple of meters away from her, and I was wearing face masks, she was wearing face masks. But still, you still get the feeling, you know, that I'm probably going to get the infection while I'm here. Maybe this would seem like it doesn't really matter, but we're doing database investigation. In the numbers, we are going to find data. We are going to find stories that are not going to be very well taken in some quarters, you know, in government, for example, in government institutions. So we need to take the appropriate precautions of how we are dealing with our databases, with all the files that we've been compiling. We're going to have to think about storing them. How do we store them, and how do we process them? Again, if we are going to be covering corruption related to the pandemic, you know, there's been in many countries stories about you know, governments or people profiteering from the sale of protective equipment, or from sale of medicines or medical supplies or whatever. There are social movements going on right now, in some cases in protest for the lockdowns, in other cases, like we're seeing in the United States and in other places, motivated by other things apart from the pandemic, racial and ethnic tensions, but that still have an element that relates to the pandemic. And that is, if you go out and protest in the streets without any kind of precautions, the probability of you getting infected is going to rise exponentially. Protests and social movements. And of course, it might be inevitable, especially as we're entering the summer and we are entering, for example, in Latin America, hurricane season. I don't know, typhoon season in Asia, but it's probably around this time. There are going to be natural disasters at some point. And we are going to need to go cover them. And there is an additional threat now. Now there is a pandemic that we also have to worry about. Other times we've never necessarily had to worry about that, or we had to worry about maybe an outbreak of cholera or diseases that are most associated with the disruption that natural disasters cause. But now we also have a pandemic to think about. So all of that has to factor in the way that we approach the different types of coverage. When we're talking about digital security, and how do we describe it? Which is basically maintain the confidentiality and the integrity of all of our digital activities, communications, devices, documents, everything we're doing online. We need to identify the potential attackers, who wants to harm us, what are their methods, how do they go about doing that, and the different risks that we face. Do we face a hack, which can be done remotely, or do we face someone that might steal our devices and try to penetrate them? They're very different risks and require different measures. So we need to have institutional protocols and procedures that are really important. And also we need to socialize them and spread them around our newsrooms. We need the training and tools to protect all of our activities, communications, passwords, browsing the internet, the way we store files, the way we interact on social media, and I'll get in a little bit of detail in that in a moment. Now, this is not part of digital security, but this is a really important dimension. Psychological security, the self-awareness of the emotional strain and the emotional impact that a particular coverage has on us. How do we need to maintain emotional and mental health in the face of stress and trauma caused by covering the pandemic? It relates to digital security because at any time that our digital activity is compromised, we are going to have, it's going to take an impact in our psyche, in our emotional well-being. We are going to start worrying about what people are learning from us, what kind of information about our work was compromised. If we get a threat via a digital medium, you know, if we get messages of intimidation or harassment, we also need to learn how to deal with that with a cool head, right? Psychological security starts before any harm is done. And it has to start with the certainty that we have to know which measures to take in the case of an attack. We have to know that our protocols exist for a reason and that they can be of some protection, maybe not an absolute protection, but they can be of some protection. And we need to learn to trust that we are taking the right measure. That goes a long way into ensuring some tranquility and some level of comfort. We're also going to be dealing with post-traumatic stress basically in two aspects. One is when we ourselves are the victim of trauma, when we have been attacked, for example, when we suffered an aggression. And two, when we, and this is the most common, when we have interaction with victims of trauma, which in the case of a pandemic is it becomes very frequent. You know, we interact with people who are sick, people who have suffered the death of a loved one. And so the trauma that we report on eventually takes a toll on us, right? And so constant self-evaluation, peer support, sharing our experiences, talking with our colleagues about it is really important to going a long way to maintaining some sort of emotional well-being, as well as some of the activities that we need to take into account that we need to do in order to sort of decompress. Some people take sports, other people take reading, watch movies, they take meditation, spirituality, yoga, they go, well, you can't go to church right now, but they go pray, whatever activity that unhooks you from the daily grind and tries to restore your well-being. The first thing that we need to do when addressing digital security as any types of security is risk analysis. And there are several ways of going about this. we need to measure this from two key figures, which are ourselves, the journalists, and the potential attackers. We need to identify who is the one that wants to harm us. And it's very different in each case. It varies from country to country or from city to city. In some cases, maybe it's organized crime. In other cases, maybe it's the government. In other cases, maybe it's social movements, security forces, businesses. We need to figure out, hang on. Oh, sorry. Okay, so we need to figure out also the 4 factors that we need to determine. 2 that pertain to the attacker. What are their capabilities and what's their will? You know, are they capable of harming us? Are they capable of attacking us? And do they really want to attack us? It's really not the same thing. Somebody that has a lot of will, somebody that really wants to do us harm, might not have the capabilities, but they can eventually get them. And someone with a lot of capability to do us harm might not be interested in learning what we're doing. You know, they might not have the need to attack us, although eventually they might. So we need to assess what's their capabilities and what's their will. And on our side, what are our strengths and what are our weaknesses? And we can measure this basically on the skills that we have in using the different tools for digital security, or the lack of skills, the lack of training, the lack of knowledge about applications and the different tools that are at our disposal. Now, that we need to learn about risk analysis in terms of the attackers is a little bit of background into the recent situation in our hometowns, our cities, the places where we work. If we go back in the last year or 2 years or 5 years, what are the most common attacks that journalists have suffered? Have they been digital attacks? Have they been physical attacks? When they've been digital attacks, what are the most common? Has it been online harassment? Has it been hacking attempts? Has it been that they steal the devices and try to penetrate them? Who are the attackers? You know, where have the attacks come from? And what capabilities have they shown, and what will have they shown? You know, how much do they want to hurt us? And how well prepared or how well equipped are they to hurt us? And we determined that by going back to the types of attacks in the past, and that sort of gives us an idea of what are our main risks. The worst mistake that you can do, anyone can do in terms of security, is preparing for a risk that you do not have. That's completely useless. It sounds obvious and it sounds like a no-brainer, but sometimes we fall into the trap of thinking that a certain safety measure is really, it has like an awesome factor to it. You know, it's really impressive, but it wouldn't help that much. Just in a training once, one colleague started talking about this encrypted platform that not even the National Security Agency of the United States had been able to crack. And I said, you know, why do you really need that? You know, because the NSA doesn't know who you are and they don't care about your investigation into corruption in the local authorities. You need to worry about the local authorities, you know, the local police chief, the local governor or mayor or whatever, and what they can do to penetrate your digital activities and steal your files and tap into the communications that you're having with your sources. You need to think about what tools are going to protect you from them, not from the NSA or you know, these big spy agencies that don't even know who you are. So that's important to take into account. Also important, as you look into the background, what are the types of coverage that motivated those attacks? Coverage on corruption usually, coverage of corruption usually motivates those attacks. I think everybody knows that in Asia and Latin America. The coverage of security forces usually motivates those attacks. in the current pandemic, any coverage that is going to question government figures, government data on cases, on deaths, on hospital capability, any coverage like that is certain to provoke a response and to provoke an attack. Other factors in risk analysis is our own position, our own strengths, and our own weaknesses. Now, this is a list of basic questions that we can ask ourselves, and we prepared a poll that I'm going to open up after the presentation. We can take just a couple of minutes to answer it, but it gives you a systematic way to approach your own strengths and weaknesses. One is to ask how frequently do you, for example, work on health centers with infected people. That gives you a certain level of your risk. How frequently do you work on data reporting, which means that you do a lot of internet browsing, means that you do a lot of database processing, means that you store a lot of files. You need to take measures to protect that. How frequently do you cover government corruption? That is, how frequently do you immerse yourself in topics that are certain to provoke a response or an attack? How frequently do you handle confidential information? Again, goes into investigations that a lot of people do not want to be known and that are certain to provoke attacks. How frequently do you cover social movements or protests? So how often are you exposed to being trapped, for example, in a demonstration, and not only risk physical harm, but also risk of losing a device, for example, a device that has a lot of information in it if you lose your smartphone or your tablet or your laptop, for example. And another level of also trying to assess our strengths and our weaknesses is to evaluate how good is, for example, our skills in using tools for messaging, for emails, for storing files, for browsing the internet, for managing our passwords, etc. How good is our relationship with colleagues at our own news organizations or with other news organizations in our city? How wide is our safety net, our solidarity networks, our support groups, people that can follow up on our investigations if something were to happen to us or if our investigations were to be compromised? How good is our relationship with our editors? Does our newspaper or a news organization, TV station, whatever, do they have our backs? Are they giving us the sufficient tools, the sufficient equipment to be safe? That's a really important question to ask. There are many countries where news organizations don't really work to protect their journalists. So I'm going to open up a poll. Everybody can answer that and make a quick assessment of how good is or where you stand in those questions, and you can rate them from 1 to 4. Not so frequently to very frequently, or not so good to very good. Again, the reminder that before you apply any safety measure, you have to make sure that it corresponds to a concrete situation, that you are taking the most appropriate measure, because if you take a tool that does not correspond or that will not protect you from the most frequent types of attacks, then it's really not relevant. Okay, so when we are crafting a safety plan, now that we thought about the background and that we thought about our how vulnerable is our situation in terms of our attackers and in terms of our own skills and knowledge and training, then we need to start devising a safety protocol. First thing we need to know is, what are we going to protect? We're going to protect our communications, that is our emails, our chats. More and more we are communicating through digital devices, and the pandemic has accelerated that. So we all use any number of applications for that. Our browsing, when we browse the internet, the other end, the place where we are browsing knows who we are, and they know what kind of pages we are visiting. So if we have a need to hide our location, our IP address, then we need to determine that, and so we can find the appropriate tool. So we need to protect our passwords. That is becoming more and more common. And it can seem very challenging because we need a password for everything, and it seems now that everything needs a password. So we need to find a good way to manage that. How are we going to protect our files? How are we going to store them? Are we going to store them in physical devices like hard drives, like our own laptop or smartphone, on USB drives, or are we going to store them in the cloud? How are we going to protect our social media? How are we, what are we posting on social media that might lead people to learn things from us? Learn where we live, or where we spend our time, learn about our family or our friends. Do we need to protect our geolocation, right? Geolocation is becoming more and more common, and most people actually have it turned on their smartphones without knowing that they can easily be located. So we need to know when or at what times we can make ourselves known to GPS and to locating tools, or when we need to hide our location. So when we face the threats and now we know what to protect, in each instance, communication, storage, browsing, whatever, we have to know our vulnerabilities. We have to know which tools we use and whether those tools are really safe. We have to identify our potential attackers. We have to evaluate how good our tools are and what's our level of risk. And in case that an attack is successful, we need to evaluate the damage and see what steps we can take to mitigate that damage. Now, once we know what we want to protect, now we have to know who do we want to protect it from. And again, looking at the background in each place, looking at the recent history of attacks, we can determine who the most frequent attackers have been. Government officials, political actors, security forces, criminal groups, businesses, our competition. I read recently that some guy, I think it was in a London paper, got fired because he was snooping in on the Zoom conferences of a rival newspaper. So the people that were doing the Zoom, they certainly didn't think about enhancing their protection. The people that we covered, they might also want to affect our works, or other people that I might not have thought about it, that are correspond to particular circumstances, or it can just be accidental, and as in the case of a natural disaster, as in the case of we might have an incident where we're covering a protest, or we might have an accident, a car accident or something like that. Again, what are the capabilities of these actors and these potential attackers, and what's their will? Do they really want to harm us, and how badly they want to harm us? And that's how we identify the potential attackers. Now, when we talk about protection, especially in digital, we used to think that we needed a plan for everything, and that plan was constantly changing. The reality is that with more and more of our activity going online, there is one protection plan that has to be permanent. Things that we always need to think about and precautions that we always need to take. And this is true not only if we were journalists, this is true of just about everybody that, everybody is migrating their lives into the digital space. So anybody with a smartphone has to have, a layer of protection that has to be permanent and that has to be well thought out. A good antivirus, to protect our devices from malware, spyware, phishing, ID theft. There are some that are commercial. There are some that are open source, crowdsourced, and there are also really good. Avast, for example. But we need to have some of that. A firewall, comes with the antivirus, but it's a different measure. The measures against unauthorized access in our device, especially against phishing. Passwords, how do we keep strong passwords? We basically need to generate passwords using different characters, multiple passwords because we need one per site. We need a safe way to store those passwords. There are some good password managers. We need to use two-factor authentication, and we need to change them frequently. Now, this is a lot of stuff for us to remember, but there are easy ways to manage that. And I think even if we're not journalists, this is really something that we must take into account. And privacy in social media. How do we distinguish our social media that we use for professional activities and for personal activities? And how do we restrict our privacy settings for that? If I use Facebook to keep in touch with friends and family, and I just post stuff about, family gatherings or parties with friends or whatever, do I really want people that I don't know to be seeing that? So I have to adjust my Facebook preferences accordingly, right? If we're on Twitter, right, and Twitter, in my case, for example, I use it for professional activities. I'm not going to post on Twitter that I'm going out on vacation with my family, for example, right? So we need to be very careful about what we post on our social media, and this is whether we're journalists or not. There is a lot of information that somebody can glean out of our social media accounts if we don't take the proper care, right? So this is something that we always need to follow every day, permanently, even after we're, even if we're outside journalism. And then there are the specific protections. The specific protections are the ones that we use when we're working on something that is very concrete, a particular investigation, for example. Whether we're working by ourselves or we're working in collaboration with someone else. How are we communicating, for example? Do we use secure chats? Do we use secure email, encrypted email? How do we call, how do we conduct our phone calls? Do we do it in voice over internet, for example, like Signal or WhatsApp? How secure is that? When we talk with sources or when we talk with partners on a specific project, how are we, when we're browsing the internet and we need to hide our IP address, are we using a web browser like Tor that is specifically designed for that? Because if we use Chrome or we use Firefox, the IP host is going to know who we are and where we are and what kind of information we're trying to access. How are we storing our information, especially if it's a collaboration? Are we using encrypted devices? Are we using clouds? And if we're using a particular tool, then everybody that shares it needs to be on the same page about how the need for safety. A safety chain is as strong as its weakest link. If someone in a chain is not following the proper safety measures, then no matter how much everybody else is following safety measures, it's useless if somebody is not following that, right? Because that's where the chain breaks, right? Again, the location, we need to determine how to activate the function to be located. My own preference is to always have it off, except when we need to be tracked, for example, or when we need to find something in our device. So this is specific protection, right? That these are the measures that apply to a particular circumstance in a temporary manner. We're doing an investigation or we're going to a risk area, a danger zone, and we need to have particular safety measures. And so we need to take those into account. Once the coverage stops, then we can basically deactivate all of that. For example, if we are going to go cover a protest, right, and there is an agreement in our newsrooms that anybody who goes cover a protest has to send his or her location via WhatsApp message to a group every 15 minutes or every half hour, just so that that the group can have a track of where that person has been in case that something happens to that person. You have a better chance of doing a successful search if you know the last place that person was seen as recently as possible. Then you need to have your location function turned on your smartphone, so you can send your location via WhatsApp message or any other tool. But once that ends, then you can turn off your location because you don't need it anymore. Now, some tools, we need to take into account that tools, there are many tools that can improve. Sorry for the typos. I'm realizing that it's actually my autocorrect, sorry. But there are tools to improve, digital security that might suit everybody's need. We need to take into account that tools change frequently, and they get superseded, and they become obsolete, some of them very, very quickly. Encrypted email, I think, is falling into disuse a little bit. RiseUp used to be pretty popular. PGP using MailVenlope, for example, or some sort of an extension on our email program. But that's being discontinued in many cases. But we can still use them. Encrypted chat Signal is, I think, right now the best one, and also the most popular one, because this is something that everybody needs to use. We're all going to be literally on the same channel. WhatsApp is safe in the sense that it is encrypted. Actually, Signal is, the people from Signal are the ones that built the encryption platform for WhatsApp. The difference between WhatsApp and Signal is that WhatsApp will turn over your messages to an authority if that authority requires them. Encryption is end-to-end. That means when I send the message, it gets encrypted. If somebody catches the message in transit, they're not going to be able to break into it. They're not going to be able to decipher it. The receiver is going to decrypt the message and be able to read it. But the message, as encrypted, can be turned over by WhatsApp to authorities when requested. Signal won't do that. So in some cases, Signal is a whole lot better. Now, if somebody gets a hold of your phone and then they can access your WhatsApp, right? Then you need to have a way, and this is something that can be done with some antivirus, commercial antivirus programs, to deactivate your phone remotely so that it just goes dead and nobody's able to access it. And this is in such so that they won't get into most of your communication apps that are in your phone. Safe browsing, Tor project has the web browser Tor, which works through a network of proxies all over the world that masks your IP address. So if you're looking, for example, at government databases, but you don't want that government office, for example, to know who has been browsing through a particular page, then you can hide your location. If you want to store your files in an encrypted cloud, there is one called Treasurit. It's really good. It's very easy to use. It's kind of like a Dropbox, but it's encrypted. There are also some things that we need to know about. Some applications that we might think are secure, but they're not. Many people think Dropbox is secure. It is not. Many people think that Google Drive is secure. It is not. They can get hacked, and if somebody hacks into your account, and they're going to take all your files away. They're going to be able to read that. Same as with the Gmail. Gmail uses end-to-end encryption, but if somebody hacks into your account, they pretty much learn everything. So Treasurit is a pretty good cloud that is encrypted, and so the files, when they're stored, they're actually stored behind an encryption code. Google Drive, Dropbox, they don't have that. Password manager, KeePass is a really good password manager. It even helps you generate the passwords, and helps you also temporize them and set you expiring dates. If you want passwords to last 3 months or 6 months, it can send you the reminders and tell you, it's time to change your password. You only need a master password to access, and then all of your passwords can be stored there. So it's really helpful. You also need to share the security. When you're part of a team, when you're part of a newsroom, or when you're part of a collaborative effort, everybody has to know each other's vulnerabilities and each other's tools. You have to share all that, especially if we're all going to be using Signal for our communication, or we're going to be using Treasury for an encrypted cloud. Everybody has to be on the same page. So everybody has to know what are the most convenient tools. Sometimes in a newsroom, there are groups of people that are more knowledgeable, more sensitive, and more aware of digital security than others. It's important to educate our colleagues, because again, the chains are always break in the weakest link. It's really a no-brainer, but it really bears repeating often that there needs to be an increased awareness in the newsrooms about digital security. Even if some people think that they are not covering things that need some safety measures, because eventually they will. And it's always better to arrive at that, having some skills and some knowledge. And also, we always need to remember that sometimes digital, analog is better than digital. Sometimes writing it down and keeping it in a piece of paper is better than having it stored on a thumb drive or on the cloud. Sometimes a call through a landline. Landlines are so uncommon now that I don't think nobody actually taps them anymore, I think. So it's, we can sometimes do safely calls from landlines, and sorry. So we can do sometimes better calls from landlines than from our phones. Also, because if somebody were to take hold of our phones, they know who we've been calling, right? Doesn't necessarily happen if you're on a landline. Sometimes maybe storing your passwords in a piece of paper and hiding it in a safe place is better than having a password manager, depending on the situation. But there might be situations where analog is better, and it's always good to never to lose sight of that, and to always keep it present. Now, in the case of an attack, we need to know what we have to do in the case of an attack. When we know that we have been hacked, maybe we fell for a phishing attack, maybe somebody tapped into our smartphone, we need to know what has to happen. Do we need to deactivate the phone, for example, change it? How does it affect my work? We need to evaluate what was stolen or what was compromised, what files, what communications were compromised. Does it affect my colleagues? Did it compromise communications that I had with other reporters, with my editors, with sources? Are other people now being able to take a look at files that I have shared with other colleagues? So we need to make them aware of that. We need to know, who do I have to warn, that, I was hacked. And so maybe they're looking at my emails and they're looking at the messages that I exchanged with other people. And so this is the way that you evaluate and the harm, and you mitigate the harm from an attack. So this is basically the overall the view of how do we go about thinking our digital security? How do we go about developing our safety protocol? How do we think about our digital activities and how to protect that? So I'm just going to open this up for questions. All right, so this is a very basic model to have to think about our digital security, and then how do we apply it into covering the pandemic. And beyond the pandemic, you know, at some point we are going to move beyond the coverage of infections and deaths, and we are going to cover, you know, very different aspects of this. And we're going to also go back to covering the issues that we were covering before. But we have moved in very rapidly. We have accelerated our move into digital platforms. So if we're conducting interviews via Zoom, which by the way is not encrypted, there was a successful petition done a few weeks ago to the Zoom company to offer encryption for every user, not just the subscribers or the premium users. And Zoom recently, a few days ago, announced that that they were going to do that. So we use Zoom, we use WhatsApp, we use Signal. We're using any number of platforms. We are using them more frequently than we used to. So we need to be more aware of the safety measures that we need to take. We're also doing more and more stuff online. We're banking online. We're ordering food, takeout online. We're sharing our personal data more often. So we need to be more sensitive, for example, to phishing attacks. You know, when they send you a link and they say, click here, and you click and there goes your phone. We're seeing that there is still software companies that are developing things like Pegasus. You know, it really hasn't gone away. So we need to be sensitive from that as we move more and more of our lives online. And if we can move on to the question, and mostly questions, but also ask you to share our experiences, to share your experiences that you have had with, if you like a recent issue where you needed a digital safety plan, or where you were left wondering what would have happened if you had if you had taken some precautions. So maybe we can open it up. I think I see 3 questions now.
Yes, we have 3 questions.
Okay. Can we really trust antivirus, provided they're the ones creating the tools and probably have some kind of back-end method to retrieve information, etc., which in turn could potentially be a threat to us? Well, that is always a risk. But the thing is, does your attacker actually have access to the antivirus company, right? I mean, they are the ones they built the back end, but they are the ones who are penetrating it, not necessarily the ones who wants to attack you, you know, not the people who want to hack you. The truth is that without an antivirus, it's easier. Let's say the local governor or the local army chief or whatever. They can't go to McAfee and say, you know, give me the back door to this guy, right? But if you don't have the antivirus, they might have the capabilities to hack into your phone. So yeah, viruses are not completely safe. Now, if you use a crowdsource, open source, like Avast, for example, they are routinely audited. And people can, other experts can look at it. They can look at the code and they can attest that it doesn't have any backdoors or backends where somebody might snoop. So yeah, there is a risk, but they are not your attackers. They are not your potential attackers. So you really need to worry about other people. What do I think of Telegram as an encrypted chat app? You know, it's safe. The general consensus is that it's safe, but it has some glitches, and you don't really know how secure your information is, because in some cases it hasn't been thoroughly audited. So if it's possible to avoid it and go on Signal, you might want to do that. It's much more secure, especially because with Signal there is a higher guarantee that your messages are not going to be shared with authorities that request it. How do we know for sure that a tool is really secure? You don't. I mean, there is no absolute security. The only thing that there is different levels of absence of risk, right? The more secure an application, the less the risk, but there is never 100% safety, and there is never 100% absence of risk. So the question is, how do you know that a particular tool is more secure than others? Look at who developed it. If it's open source, that means that other experts can audit it, and they can look at the code, as I said, with the antiviruses, and so they can sort of vouch whether the technology is safe. Signal, for example, is one such thing. Treasury is another if you talk about clouds. So I would prefer Signal to WhatsApp, for example. If you're using it for like daily stuff, you might just as well use Gmail, right? It's pretty safe. But if you are going to start sharing sensitive stuff, try to look for something else that has added levels of safety, and then you can look in the different recommendations. There is a good guide that is called Security in a Box. It's developed by an organization called Tactical Tech, and they have a really good toolkit. And anytime you have a doubt about a particular application or a particular platform, you can go in there, Security in a Box, and they can give you a good rating on whether that is secure or not. If I know of any trainings or resources targeted for journalists who work in higher risk countries like China and Philippines, I can't recall any concrete ones on the top of my head, but I would say that some of the projects that are being supported by something called the Open Tech Fund, which is based in the United States, and they have developed any number of tools. For example, they supported a project called Free WeChat that monitors and tracks and retrieves the censored messages that the Chinese government is blocking on WeChat, for example. So you can go on, it's called the Open Tech Fund. You can Google it and go on their page, and they have the number of projects, and many of them actually working, they have a lot of them working in Asia. In Taiwan, there are some of them in Taiwan, some of them in Hong Kong, in Vietnam. And you can go in there, and they have a list of some of them. They're for evading censorship, for protecting privacy. I know that some people who were, some of the protesters in Hong Kong were using some of those tools to hide their locations and hide the IP addresses from the points that they were posting messages online. So yeah, there are a number of initiatives that are working in Asia to basically to circumvent censorship and to protect privacy. The next question is, sometimes when we receive phishing links, we might not realize it. Spur of the moment, we might click it, or the link might look believable. What is the one thing you would advise us to do when we receive links that is possibly trying to phish info? The first thing is look at who sent it. If you know the sender, then it's probably safe. If you don't recognize the sender, then don't click on it, right? If you recognize the sender, but the document looks suspicious, for example, if the sender doesn't usually send you PowerPoint slides, right, or Excel documents or whatever. Let's say the sender, when he or she sends you documents, they use Google Docs instead of Microsoft Word, but now they send you a Microsoft Word. Then write back to that person and say, did you send me this? Before you actually open the link or open the file. If something looks suspicious, even if you recognize the sender, send the message to the sender and confirm that they sent you that. After you confirm that or not, then you can determine that. But you have to be suspicious at every time that you receive the message that is not through the usual channels. Junior, you want to take a crack at this?
Yes, so that's a good question, because sometimes you may receive links also via WhatsApp, or Telegram. The link ostensibly may look legit, but if you're using a web-based browser app to actually view your messages, you can actually mouse over but don't click and actually view the underlying link below it, and then you may realize that it's actually not the link that it says it is. So you can't actually tell on a mobile phone, but if you're suspicious, you can view it later in your web app version of that, like WhatsApp, for example, WhatsApp web, and then check the link. Because I've actually done that before, and I realized that, oh, it's not the legit company that it says it is. And that's pretty scary, because on a mobile phone, you just sort of click and you don't think twice. And as journalists, you're rushing around. You don't really, you're getting tons of messages all day long from your newsroom, from your contacts, and so on. You may not have actually the time to check the authenticity of that link. So yeah, very, very.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to fall for the trap, but usually the phishing messages, they fall out of the predictable, right? And so if somebody, one of your contacts, when you usually chat with that contact, but you never exchange web links, and eventually a message comes from that, then you might just be suspicious, right? Or if it's it has a weird wording in the URL. If the address has a weird wording, or it doesn't correspond with the name of the website. I mean, there are tells. There are some signs. Yeah, like Juni says, sometimes we are just too frantic and that we click through everything. But we need to be very discriminatory to what we and how we filter the stuff that we get on messages.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe Javier, you might also like to give some of your own examples, because your paper in the past has gone through so much physical threats as well as digital threats. So I think to sort of start that going, maybe you can also give some examples of your own personal stories.
Well, I might say my one personal experience that I might have when I was editor of a newspaper that mostly suffered physical attacks. Armed attacks against the building, and we suffered several them. And we suffered threats that usually came over the phone message, a message in a reporter's phone. Getting a message, an intimidatory message on your phone leaves you with a mark. You need to learn to manage that. Like I said, the psychological impact is really important, because you don't know what kind of crap you're getting on your smartphone. So you need to be able to deal with those messages in a cool manner. But when you go into a more serious physical risk, like say a colleague gets kidnapped, right? And when a colleague gets kidnapped, they get kidnapped with their phone, right? And it's pretty. You can be certain that the kidnappers are going to force your colleague to open up their phones, right? And they're going to see who they called, who they exchanged messages with, what kind of messages they exchanged, what they were talking about, who are their sources. And so any number of people on the other end, your other reporters, family members, they would be compromised. They would be known to these attackers. So you need to learn how to take steps. When you see, for example, that a colleague has been kidnapped and that there is a reasonable fear that somebody else might have had access to his or her phone, then you need to know, maybe block the contact, right? You can even change your number, or you can, if you're the editor of that reporter, for example, you need to alert everybody that there's their immediate circle. I guess now with the contact tracing that's become really famous, I guess that's an applicable analogy. You need to identify the closer contacts, so who might be exposed, to the kidnappers, knowing about phone numbers and what they were talking about over messages. And you need to take the appropriate measures. Is maybe block that person, maybe change your number, right? Or go offline for a little bit so that they won't reach you. So when a physical attack always has a digital dimension, because you're carrying your phone or your laptop or your tablet, right? So whenever you get physically attacked, let's say you're at a protest, you lose your phone, right? Did you make a backup, right? That's something that I forgot to mention, but how often do you make backups? How often do you back up your information, right? Because, if you have everything stored in your smartphone and it gets stolen or it gets cracked and goes useless, how are you going to retrieve all the information that you have there? So you always need to integrate your model and think that the physical attack has a digital dimension. The digital attack might have a physical dimension or a psychological dimension. And so your model has to be really comprehensive.
Yes, Javier, Edith has a question about TikTok and other apps. So she's asking, what about TikTok, Facebook app, and other apps which are widely used nowadays? Is there a way these apps may encroach on user privacy?
I mean, TikTok, I don't use TikTok. I still try to figure out how it works. The way that these apps, you don't know how these apps encroach in privacy in the sense of how much of the information you are giving away. I don't use TikTok, so I really don't know what kind of information TikTok asks of me when I'm signing up for an account. I mean, I know what Facebook asks, and I know what Twitter asks, and that's pretty much information that everybody else has, right? My email address, my cell phone. My worry with something like TikTok, which is also my worry with Instagram, and to a certain extent with Facebook, but if you use Facebook for personal purposes, you might mitigate your risk a little bit if you restrict your privacy settings. But with TikTok and Instagram is that you yourself are compromising your privacy when you are broadcasting, for example, what is going on in your house, right? And if you're doing a TikTok when you're in your bedroom, but first of all, you're letting a lot of people see what your bedroom looks like. And I'm not sure that I would like other people to see the inside of, I mean, I'm letting you guys see the inside of my my library, but this is pretty much it, right? But if I'm doing TikToks dancing in my bedroom and dancing in front of my house, God knows how many people are seeing that, right? Or Instagramming my kids or things like that, right? So my worry about platforms with TikTok isn't so much how much information I'm giving the platform when I'm signing up. Is how much information I'm broadcasting when I'm doing, a TikTok or taking a picture.
Okay, yes. Arturo has a question as well about the TikTok app, saying the TikTok app is not as dangerous as it is. What's dangerous is the permissions that you give it once you use the app. So that's a good point. I think with Snapchat as well, Snapchat has an ability, for the Snapchat heat map, you can actually make your location public. And I think with WeChat as well, you can do that. So yeah, what do you think of that?
What are the apps? I mean, you have to ask yourself, what are the apps that you are giving permission to interact with the other functions of your phone, like your camera or your microphone, right? And so you have to be very aware of, what kind of applications you are authorizing to use them. TikTok can interact with pretty much any other function of your smartphone, so there is a lot of information that you're giving away. So, I mean, I think this is really just a matter of preferences. At this point, you need to know how much of your or you need to determine how much of your privacy you are willing to compromise. If you want to use Snapchat, if you want to use TikTok. If you want to merge some applications and give one application the permissions of the other application, then you see how those two interact. they might have more access to your data than if you keep them separately. So it's really just a question of making the determination of how much you want to share. There is no way that you can be completely private on the internet. I think we're way beyond that. So it's just, okay, how private can I be, right?
Absolutely. I think look at all the settings in your social media apps. They are there. It's just that, you know, sometimes they are buried. You know, there are under headings that, you know, we don't understand. But there are updates as well, and there are messages. So often, I think we have no time to read them. But when they change the user agreement, you know, you'll be notified that there's been a change in the user agreement, and there's like, you know, 10,000 lines of instructions, and, you know, the new agreement. But often the change there and giving you more power over privacy and so on. But again, some people set up, some journalists and editors set up a public profile, private profile is only for your family members perhaps and friends, and then there's the public profile where you put all your professional stuff on as well. The other thing, of course, with all the tracing apps now for COVID, all our privacy is it has been shot to hell.
I haven't gotten that deep into contact tracing apps because they're not being used in Mexico. I don't think anybody here actually cares about contact tracing. So they haven't become that popular. So we haven't really been able to dig deep into how much they compromise your privacy. There's a question on the chat about VPNs, the security of existing VPN services, whether from state actors or private third parties. VPNs are, you know, very secure. You know, they're the most security that you get close to. The thing is not necessarily that state actors can actually penetrate the VPNs. It's really hard to do that. There are some good open source ones. Tunnel Bear is one of them, pretty popular. Open Tech Fund has their list of projects, has supported and financed some of those projects. My concern is how easy it would be for states to block VPNs, because they have been increasingly successful at doing that. So I think in each country, it's really different which kind of VPN that you would want to use, that, you know, the ones that have been able to circumvent government blockages. But from an outsider to penetrate a VPN, that's really hard. That's really, really hard. They would need to physically hack your computer to actually do that.
But there is the trade-off as well with using of VPNs, obviously. So there could be delays, slightly slower network, and then you are actually depending on connectivity from like two levels. So the basic connectivity plus the VPN encryption. So that as well could slow things down. And sometimes the VPN drops. So
yeah,
there's that trade-off.
One thing is, I mean, I'm pretty sure many of you already know this, but it's a common mistake. Anonymous browsing, like the function that Firefox or Chrome has, that's not, you know, that doesn't hide anything. That only hides your cookies and your browsing history, but that doesn't hide your location. And it certainly doesn't hide or protect the communication that you are having with the hosts and the servers of the websites that you are accessing. So don't take any false sense of security from them.
The thing about again location tracking is that some newsrooms actually do use it to track the safety of their journalists. For example, in the middle of a protest, they need to know where reporter A is and reporter B is and which street corner. So yes, it can be. It's not a bad thing, because for the newsrooms, some newsrooms do require that, so they can keep a lookout for their journalists out in the field. Yeah, I guess it's just a matter of like who you share it with, and then remember to switch it off after you're done with the day.
Right.
Okay, everyone. If there are no other questions for Javier, you will get his deck and get a link to this recording. I hope you'll be also, this will be helpful for you to share with your colleagues. And there were some questions also about the links that Javier mentioned to the tools and the playbook. We'll get that from you, Javier, later on, as to the best practices. I think ultimately, at the end of the day, it's really a matter of convenience versus control. there are the trade-offs. You, as IT managers or as even journalists trying to protect yourselves, you have to make that decision as to whether you want to control and protect yourself, or you just want the convenience. Very grateful to all of you for attending today's session. Thank you, Javier, for your tips. When I last did this webinar about 3 years ago, it was like the most popular topic, a series of about 12 to 14 webinars. And in the time of COVID,
it's always a really popular topic, and it's really useful.
Yes.
So I think that it's never you can always use a good refresher course, and I think as like I was saying, as the pandemic has accelerated our move to digital in many things that we didn't used to do it that way. Then it merits more awareness. I would just leave you with a final thought. As you look through the presentation, I mean, the thing that you can conclude from the presentation is don't go straight for the tools, right? You have to think through first, and then then look at the tools. We have a temptation of going straight to the tools, the different platforms or apps. Try to avoid that and try to think about your safety first before you take your first steps.
Yes, and we hope all the tips today will literally help you save yourselves from a lot of grief, and your colleagues as well from a lot of grief later on if you're hacked, or your information has been stolen, or if you're working on a exclusive story and someone has broken into that. You really don't want those things to happen. And of course, sometimes there are also more sinister parties involved as well. So we hope you'll be able to protect yourself with all these tips. Leads me to just thank Javier and my team here in Singapore supporting this webinar. So to Wilson, Jen, Serene, Jeanette, and Tom, thank you very much too for joining us online today. And if you have any questions, please, Jen will be in touch. So I'll send over your questions to Jen and share the link as well to the recording when it's out. Okay. Thanks a lot, Javier.
Thank you, Jenny, and thanks everyone for participating. It's been great.
Okay, thank you.